She was already halfway across the lobby when his voice cut through the room like a blade. Stop. One word. Lucian Moretti didn't shout. He never had to. The 12 men seated around that polished conference table, men who had buried problems, bought silence, and survived. Things most people never lived long enough to describe, every single one of them went still. Because when Lucian Moretti said stop, the air itself listened. Evelyn Hart froze with her hand on the door handle, her back to the room, her coffee tray balanced in both hands. She had spent 3 years perfecting the art of not being noticed. 3 years of arriving early, leaving late, keeping her voice low and her eyes lower. 3 years of making herself so useful and so quiet that powerful men forgot she was there at all, which was exactly how she needed it. She turned around slowly. Lucian was already on his feet, not moving, just watching her. His dark eyes had that quality she had learned to recognize and never fully gotten used to, the quality of a man who looked at something and actually saw it rather than just registering its presence. "Come here," he said. It wasn't a question. It never was. But it also wasn't the kind of command that left bruises. She had learned the difference between those two things the hard way. She crossed the room, set the tray down without being asked, kept her breathing even. She was good at that, keeping her breathing even when everything inside her was screaming. "Your wrist," Lucian said. The sleeve. She had pulled it down before she came in. She was sure of it. She was always sure of it. "It's nothing," she said. "Show me, Mr. Moretti." Evelyn, just her name. Quiet, not angry, not impatient, just certain. The way a man says a name when he already knows the answer and is simply waiting for you to stop pretending he doesn't. She set her jaw, considered her options, decided she had none that mattered. Pushed the sleeve up 2 inches. The bruise had gone yellow at the edges. That meant it was 4, maybe 5 days old. It ran from the inside of her wrist to the middle of her forearm, in a shape that was unmistakably a handprint. 4 fingers and a thumb pressed so hard into flesh that even a week later the story was still there, written in green and brown and fading purple. Nobody at the table spoke. Lucian looked at it for a long moment. His expression didn't change, not exactly, but something behind it did. Something shifted, the way ice shifts, when the temperature drops a single final degree, before it locks solid. "Everyone out," he said. They filed out without a word. 12 men who argued about money, territory, loyalty, and power, men who interrupted each other, challenged each other, occasionally threatened each other across that same table, and not one of them said a single thing as they collected their jackets and their phones and their pride and walked out the door. Marco, Lucian's head of security, was the last one through. Pulled the door shut behind him without being asked. Then it was just the 2 of them, Evelyn and the man who employed her. The man she had spent 3 years trying to stay invisible around. The man who had apparently been watching her anyway. "Sit down," Lucian said. "I'm fine standing. I know you are." He pulled out the chair closest to her and stepped back from it, giving her the space, not filling it. "Sit down anyway. You've been on your feet since 6:30. She sat. Not because he told her to, because her legs were shaking, and she didn't want him to see that on top of everything else. He sat across from her, not at the head of the table, where he usually positioned himself at power's natural center, but across from her, close at her level. He laced his fingers on the table and didn't reach for anything. Didn't pick up his phone, didn't glance at the door, just looked at her. "Who did that to you?" he asked. "I already said. I heard what you said." His voice was level. Not cold, not warm. Somewhere in between, the way a good doctor sounds when they're asking something important, and they need you to hear them asking it. "I'm asking you again." Evelyn looked at her hands, her left hand specifically, the finger that had worn a ring for 14 months and had been bare for 7. The skin there had smoothed over. You couldn't see the absence anymore unless you knew to look. "It's a personal matter," she said. "It doesn't affect my work. I didn't ask if it affected your work. It doesn't involve anyone connected to this organization." "That's not what I asked either." She looked up, "Mr. Moretti," with respect. "What exactly are you asking?" He held her gaze without flinching. "I'm asking who put their hand on you, hard enough to leave a mark that's still showing, a week later. And I'm asking because I'd like to know, not because it affects my business, not because I need to know. Because I'm sitting across from you right now, and you're the only other person in this room, and I'm asking." Evelyn said nothing. He waited. He was very good at waiting. Outside the conference room, She could hear the muffled sounds of the office resuming footsteps, a phone ringing, someone's voice low and careful, the ordinary sounds of a world that had no idea this conversation was happening. "His name is Caleb Mercer," she said finally. The name felt strange in her mouth in this room, like bringing something from one world and holding it up to the light of another. We were engaged. We're not anymore. He doesn't." She stopped, started again. "He doesn't accept that." Lucian nodded once, slowly, like he was filing something away carefully. How long? How long what? How long has this been going on?" Thought about lying. Calculated the angle. Decided it was pointless. Not because she trusted Lucian Moretti with her secrets, but because the man across from her had spent his life reading people, and she was tired. She was so profoundly, bone-deep, tired of the effort it took to conceal something that was already written on her skin. 3 years, she said, give or take. He was quiet for a moment. "You've been working for me. For 3 years, yes. The whole time, yes." Another pause. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't read, or maybe she could read it and didn't want to, because it looked like the kind of anger that doesn't make noise and doesn't go away easily. "Has he been inside this building?" "No." "Does he know where you work?" She hesitated. That fraction of a second was its own answer. "He knows the building," she said. "He doesn't have access." "That's not the same thing as him not knowing where you work." "No," she admitted, "it isn't." Lucian stood up. Not abruptly. He rarely did anything abruptly. He moved with the kind of deliberate control that comes from years of learning that the person who moves first moves wrong. He walked to the window, stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the Chicago skyline for a moment, before he turned back to her. "Tell me what's happening," he said. "All of it. Not the version where you're fine. You don't need to know all of it. Maybe not. I'm asking anyway. Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because you've worked in this building for 3 years, and you are one of the most capable people in it. And you come in here every morning, looking like someone who's been holding their breath since they woke up. And whatever this man is doing to you, it's not nothing. And I don't," he paused, just barely. "I don't want to sit across from you and pretend I don't see it. I'm not built that way." Evelyn studied him. She had spent 3 years studying Lucian Moretti from the corner of rooms, from behind the lens of someone who was paid to observe and record and disappear. She knew his patterns, knew his tolerances, knew the specific way his jaw set when he was calculating something, and the slightly different way it set when he had already decided. Right now, she couldn't read him, which was unusual enough to be its own piece of information. "If I tell you," she said carefully, "I need something from you first. All right, I need you to not make any decisions for me. Whatever you hear, whatever you think, no decisions. Not without my agreement." He considered this. "That's fair." "I mean it, Mr. Moretti. I've spent 3 years watching you solve problems by," she chose her words carefully, "by applying pressure until the problem resolves. I'm not a problem to be resolved." Something crossed his face. Something that might have been surprise or respect, or both operating at the same time. "No," he said quietly. "You're not." "Then we have an agreement?" "We have an agreement," he said. And the strange, unsettling thing was that she believed him. Talked for 40 minutes. She had never told it as a single story before. Pieces of it her mother knew, fragments. Her one remaining close friend knew other fragments. But the whole shape of it, the architecture of the thing, she had never laid it out in sequence. When she did, even she was a little shocked by how it sounded. It had started so quietly. That was the thing she always struggled to explain. There was no single moment she could point to and say, "There, that was when I should have run." It had been degrees, increments. The way Caleb had started taking over the small decisions, where they ate dinner, how she spent her weekends, who she saw, and how often, so gradually that by the time she noticed, the habit was already formed. Pattern already set. Her world already smaller than it had been before. And somehow she had believed that was just how love worked. That it felt like slowly losing the edges of yourself. The money started 18 months ago. At least that was when she'd noticed it. Small withdrawals, at first 200. Here, 300 there from the joint account they'd opened when they moved in together. When she asked, Caleb had an explanation for each one. He always had explanations. He was one of the most articulate men she'd ever met, and she had once considered that a virtue. By the time she understood what was happening, that the explanations were constructed, not remembered, that the money was not going where he said it was going. She was already 14 months engaged, already financially interwoven in ways that would take time to unwind, already professionally dependent on references that were, she would later understand, subtly poisoned. Poisoned, Lucian repeated. He contacted 2 of my former supervisors, she said. I only found out about one of them. He told them I'd had issues. Reliability issues, ethical concerns. He was careful about the language. Nothing specific enough to be provable, just enough to make them hesitate if anyone asked. He knew people you'd worked for. He knew everything about me. I told him everything. She said it flatly, without the self-pity that the statement might have warranted. Just a fact. A mistake she had made with the information that had been available to her at the time. I trusted him because he was very, very good at being trustworthy when it mattered. Lucian was quiet for a moment. How did you end it? I left while he was traveling. Took what was mine and moved. Changed my number. Filed a report, not that it went anywhere. He hadn't technically done enough in any single category to constitute a clear legal violation. She paused. He was careful about that too, but he's still contacting you. He appears where I am. At the grocery store. At the coffee shop I used to go to every morning. I had to stop going. 3 months ago he was waiting in the parking structure near my apartment. She looked at the table. He doesn't touch me when we're in public. He just stands there, close enough, and talks to me like we're still together, like I never left. Lucian had gone very still, the kind of still that wasn't calm so much as it was contained. He was in the parking structure. He said, yes. 3 months ago. Yes. And that wasn't in public. She kept her voice level. He was inside my apartment. I don't know how he got in. I've since changed the locks twice and added a security system. She exhaled slowly. He was standing in my kitchen when I came home. The silence in the room changed quality. He said he just wanted to talk, Evelyn continued. That all of this, the leaving, the report, the changed number, was a misunderstanding between us that we needed to resolve. When I told him to leave, She stopped, looked at her wrist, looked back up. He didn't hit me. He held my arm. He was explaining something to me, and he needed me to stand still long enough to hear it. She said it exactly the way it had happened, without dramatic color, without a tremor in her voice. That was the thing about having survived, something you could describe it afterward in a tone that was almost neutral. The neutrality wasn't strength. It was just the accumulated weight of having told yourself it was fine so many times that the telling had its own texture. Evelyn. Lucian said her name quietly, like the way you touch something that might break. I'm telling you this, she said, so that you understand the situation, not so that you'll fix it. I have attorneys working on the financial piece. I'm building a legal record. It's slow, but it's moving. I don't need you to do anything. All right. I mean that. I know you do, he said. And then carefully, can I tell you what I'm going to do anyway? Just so you know. Not to ask permission. Just so you're not surprised. She considered. Yes, I'm going to have Marco run a security assessment on this building. Standard protocol. I should have done it 6 months ago. He watched her. I'm going to ask him to include the parking structure in that assessment. Not standard protocol, he said again, steadily. Nothing to do with you specifically, just overdue. She looked at him for a long moment. He was giving her an out, framing something that was absolutely about her as something impersonal, so that she didn't have to feel the weight of it as charity or interference, or yet another person making a decision over her head, thoughtful enough that it made her throat tighten unexpectedly. Thank you, she said, quietly. You don't have to thank me. I know. She stood, straightened her jacket, pulled her sleeve back into place with a gesture so practiced she didn't even notice she was doing it. I should get back to one more thing. She paused. The morning you start coming in looking like you can breathe, Lucian said, will be enough. She didn't answer that. She wasn't sure she had an answer for it. She picked up her coffee tray, still perfectly balanced, the cups not even shifted, and walked to the door. Behind her, she heard him sit back down, heard the quiet sound of papers being moved, the gunsed sounds of a man returning to work, as if the last 40 minutes had been any other meeting, as if he hadn't just sat across from her and asked her questions that no one in 3 years had thought to ask. She opened the door. The office noise came back, phones, voices, the distant hum of the elevator. The ordinary world, her world. The one she had built inside the edges of this organization because it was safe and predictable and the only thing she'd been able to hold together when everything else was being taken apart. She stepped through and pulled the door closed behind her. And for the first time, in longer than she could accurately remember, the door at her back felt like a beginning rather than just an escape. The morning after that conversation, Evelyn arrived at 7:43 as usual. She made coffee, checked the calendar, forwarded 3 emails to the correct departments, and sat at her desk as if nothing had changed. Because outwardly, nothing had. She was still the executive assistant. She still answered to the title. She still existed, functionally, at the edge of the room. But something had shifted, and she knew it, and she suspected Lucian knew it too. Marco came by her desk at 9:15 with a form about parking structure access codes that required her to update her registration. He handed it to her without making eye contact, explained the procedure in 2 sentences, and moved on. He did not mention her specifically. He did not explain why the procedure was happening now, 6 months after the access codes had last been updated. Filled out the form and handed it back. At 10 o'clock, an email arrived from an attorney named Catherine Reeves, who specialized in financial coercion cases, introducing herself and noting that she'd been made aware of a situation that might benefit from legal consultation, and asking if Evelyn would be willing to speak by phone at her convenience. Evelyn stared at the email for a long moment. Then she looked across the office toward the conference room, where through the glass she could see Lucian on the phone, his back half turned, apparently absorbed in something else entirely. He had not said he would do nothing. He had said he wouldn't make decisions for her. He had kept exactly that distinction, and nothing more. She drafted a reply to Catherine Reeves, short, professional, agreed to a call Friday at noon. She read it over once, changed 1 word, and sent it. Then she picked up her notepad and walked toward the conference room because there was a meeting in 12 minutes, and the agenda still needed confirming. Because she was the executive assistant, and that was her job, and the world had not, regardless of what had shifted inside it, stopped requiring her to do it. She knocked twice and opened the door. Lucian glanced up from his phone, raised an eyebrow. "Meeting in 12, she said. "I know. Castellano's delayed by 20 minutes. Do you want to hold the room or start without him?" He thought about it for exactly the amount of time it took to think about it. "Start without him. He can catch up." "Understood." She made the note. "Turn to go, Evelyn." She stopped, didn't turn around. "Yes?" A pause, small, almost nothing. "Good morning," he said. She turned her head just enough. "Good morning, Mr. Moretti." She went back to her desk. She had 4 things to do before the meeting, and 11 minutes to do them. She put her head down and started. But underneath the ordinary motions of the morning, something was moving, quiet and not yet named. The way a season changes not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small shifts in temperature, in light, in the quality of the air. Something was different. She had told the truth to a man who hadn't asked her to minimize it. She had been heard, and somewhere underneath the discipline and the control and the practiced art of invisibility, some part of Evelyn Hart was beginning slowly, carefully, like a thing that had been held underwater for a very long time to surface. Call with Catherine Reeves lasted 47 minutes. Evelyn had taken it in the small conference room on the 4th floor, the one nobody used on Friday afternoons, because it faced west and got the full weight of the afternoon sun through glass that had never been properly tinted. She sat with her back to the window and let the heat press against her shoulders and kept her voice steady through the entire conversation. Catherine was not what she'd expected. Evelyn had braced for the careful, slightly performative gentleness that some attorneys deployed with clients who had been through difficult circumstances, the soft voice, the extra pause after hard questions, the implicit message that you were fragile and they were handling you accordingly. Catherine Reeves did none of that. She asked direct questions in a direct voice and wrote down the answers without editorializing. And when Evelyn finished explaining the financial situation, Catherine said, "Okay, that's workable. Here's what we need," and moved straight into logistics. Evelyn had liked her immediately. The list of documents Catherine needed was long. Bank statements going back 30 months, phone records, emails, any written communication from Caleb, however casual, the lease from the apartment they'd shared, the joint account records showing the withdrawal pattern, any records from the 2 former employers Caleb had contacted even second-hand accounts, even vague impressions. He was careful, Evelyn said. He didn't leave clean evidence. They never do, Catherine said. That's not the same as leaving nothing. People who operate like this think they're invisible because they've never had anyone look properly. We're going to look properly. After the call, Evelyn sat in the hot conference room for a few minutes longer than she needed to. The sun had moved enough to hit the side of her face. Outside the window, Chicago moved through its Friday afternoon the way Chicago always did, with complete indifference to whatever was happening inside any particular building on any particular floor. She had a legal team now. She had apparently a security upgrade she hadn't asked for. She had Lucian Moretti's word, which was she was still calibrating exactly what that was worth and what it cost. She gathered her notepad and her phone and went back to work. Following Tuesday, Caleb called her office line. Not her cell, not a text, not an email, her direct office line, which was listed on the company website under general contact information and which she had never given him. She stared at the number on her desk phone display for 2 full rings before she picked up. Evelyn. His voice was warm. It was always warm. About Caleb, that had taken her so long to understand warmth, was not evidence of safety. Warmth was something a person could manufacture and deploy as a tool the same way they could deploy anything else. I've been trying to reach you. I know, she said. Kept her voice level. She was at her desk in an open office, and she was not going to have this hot conversation in front of people, and she was also not going to hang up, because hanging up gave him the next move. What do you want, Caleb? I want to talk. Just talk. Feel like things have gotten a pause carefully placed, complicated, between us. And I think if we could sit down somewhere quiet. There's nothing to talk about. Evelyn, don't call this number again. She kept her voice flat, quiet. She was aware of Petra 3 desks away, pretending very hard not to listen. If you need to contact me, go through my attorney. You have her information. A beat of silence. When he spoke again, the warmth had shifted, not disappeared. Just changed register. Like a musician moving to a lower key. You got an attorney. Yes. That's another pause. That's a significant step. It is, she agreed. Evelyn, I really think you're misunderstanding the situation. The money. Whatever, Catherine. Whoever told you about the money, I can explain every single transaction. If you'd just let me, Caleb. She said his name once, cleanly. Don't call this number again. She hung up. Her hand was completely steady. She noted that, filed it away, picked up her pen and made a note of the call time, duration, summary of content, the way Catherine had instructed her to document every contact. She dated it, put it in the folder she'd started keeping in the bottom drawer of her desk. Then she stood up, walked to the kitchen, poured herself a cup of coffee she didn't particularly want, and stood at the counter for 90 seconds, reminding herself how to breathe like a normal person. When she came back, there was a message on her email from Marco. Parking structure access log review complete. Flagged 1 anomaly exterior camera on level 3 has been cycling offline at irregular intervals since late October. Maintenance has been notified. Issue should be resolved by end of week. Let me know if you have questions. Late October. She had moved her car to level 3 in September because level 2 had been under repair. She read the email twice. Then she forwarded it to Catherine with a single line, possible documentation, access, and surveillance patterns. She went back to work. It was 11 days later when Evelyn first noticed the numbers. It wasn't her job to notice them. She was the executive assistant. She managed schedules, coordinated logistics, filtered communications, and kept the operational machinery of Lucian Moretti's legitimate business empire running with the kind of frictionless efficiency that made itself invisible. She was not the financial officer. She was not the internal auditor. She did not have access to the operational accounts, except in the peripheral way that someone who organized meetings and compiled reports for the people who did have access would naturally accumulate a kind of residual awareness, which was how she noticed. She had been compiling a quarterly summary for the board, pulling data from 7 different department reports, formatting them into a single document, the kind of task that required her to read without processing, to move numbers from one place to another, without thinking about what they meant. And somewhere in the middle of the 3rd department's figures, something snagged. Not wrong exactly, just off, a pattern that didn't quite fit the surrounding patterns. like a word that was spelled correctly, but used incorrectly. The kind of error that a spell checker would miss, because the individual elements were all fine, and only the relationship between them was wrong. She went back, read the numbers again, then pulled the previous quarter's report and compared. It took her an hour and a half to be sure enough to feel the cold settle into the back of her neck. The discrepancy was small in percentage terms, barely a fraction. But across the scale of what moved through this organization, a fraction was not a small number, and more importantly, the pattern of it was wrong. It wasn't random variation, the kind that came from normal fluctuation in expenses, or timing differences in receivables. It was consistent. It had a shape. It moved in one direction in regular intervals, in amounts that were calibrated to stay below whatever threshold triggered automatic review. Someone had done this carefully, someone who understood the systems, someone who had been doing it long enough that the cumulative effect was significant. Evelyn sat very still at her desk for a long moment. Then she closed the report, locked her screen, and went to find Lucian. He was on a call. She knocked anyway 2 short raps, her standard signal, and opened the door 6 inches. He looked up. She held up 3 fingers, their shorthand, for I need 3 minutes when you're done, and he nodded once without breaking his sentence. She waited in the hallway. 12 minutes, which was longer than 3, but she didn't pace and she didn't check her phone. She stood with her back against the wall and looked at the middle distance and thought about the shape of the numbers. When the door opened, he stepped back to let her in. She came through and he closed it behind her. "What is it?" he said. Not a question, a door opening. She put the printed pages on his desk, 2 of them with specific figures circled in red pen. She didn't sit down. "I was compiling the board summary. I may have found something. I want you to look at it before I say anything specific, because I want to know if you're seeing what I'm seeing or if I'm wrong." He looked at her for a moment, that direct, taking measure look she had gotten used to, and then he picked up the pages. She watched his face as he read them. He was not a man whose expressions moved easily, but she had spent 3 years cataloging the small ones. Slight tightening at the corner of his jaw, the way his eyes moved back to the same figure twice. The small stillness that came over him when something landed. He read both pages, set them down, picked up the first one again, and looked at a specific row for a moment. "How long?" he said. "Based on what I can see from the quarterly reports, at least 8 months. Probably longer. I only had access to the last 3 quarters in the summary materials. Pattern? Consistent. Regular intervals. Calibrated to stay just under the automatic review threshold." She paused. "Someone knows where that threshold is." He set the page down. His hands were flat on the desk, perfectly still. "Who else has seen this?" "No one. I came straight to you." He nodded once. The muscle in his jaw moved. "I could be wrong," she said. "You're not wrong." He said it quietly, without drama. "I've been watching a variation of this for 6 weeks. I didn't have enough to be certain." He looked up at her. "You found the thread I was missing." Something in the room shifted. She wasn't sure if it was the air or just her own perception of it. "Who has access to these accounts?" she asked. She kept her voice neutral, like she was asking about a scheduling conflict, like her heart wasn't doing something odd inside her chest. Lucian looked at her for a moment, like he was calculating something, like he was deciding how much weight to put on a surface before testing whether it would hold. 3 people, he said, myself. Our financial officer, Rita Chen, and Daniel. She knew Daniel Voss. Everyone in the building knew Daniel Voss. 8 years with the organization, Lucian's aide and confidant, the man whose name appeared on every document that required a second signature, whose opinion was solicited before any significant decision was made. The man who had been sitting in the room 12 days ago when Lucian had looked at Evelyn's wrist and sent everyone out. He did not say his name. She didn't need to. They both knew the math. "Rita Chen is 61 years old, Lucian said quietly, almost to himself. "She has been with this organization since before I took it over. She is 8 months from retirement. She has a granddaughter named after her." He paused. "The threshold that was avoided is not public information. It's internal protocol. Rita wrote the protocol. Evelyn said nothing. She let him land on it himself. She would have no reason to circumvent a system she designed," he said. "No," Evelyn agreed. The silence was not comfortable. It was the specific silence of a conclusion that nobody wanted to reach. "I need more than this," Lucian said finally. He tapped the papers. I need the full trail. Every transaction. Source accounts. Destination. Any layering in between. I need it documented completely before I move. I understand. Can you? He stopped. Started again. I'm going to need someone I trust to build that documentation. Someone who can access the summary materials without it becoming visible that they're looking. She understood what he was asking before he finished asking it. I already have access to the summary materials. It's part of my job function. Nobody would question me pulling historical reports. This is not in your job description. A lot of things aren't in my job description, she said. And then, because it was true, I'm good with patterns. I've had a lot of practice noticing things that aren't quite right. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she still couldn't fully read. This could get complicated. I'm aware. If Daniel realizes someone is looking, then I'll need to be careful. She picked up the 2 pages from his desk, which I also have a lot of practice with, a beat, and then something moved across Lucian's face that she had not seen there before. Not quite a smile, more the shadow of one, or the suggestion of what one might look like, on a face that had trained itself out of the habit. All right, he said. She took the pages and went back to work. Spent the next 9 days being very careful. She pulled historical reports in batches, spaced across different times of day, mixing the relevant queries in with the ordinary operational requests she made constantly as part of her normal function. She built the documentation at home, on her personal laptop, transferring nothing through the company network. She cross-referenced 3 different sets of summary materials and mapped every anomalous transaction against the timeline, the account structure, the withdrawal patterns. On the 5th day, she found the destination account, or rather, she found the first layer, a holding account registered to a shell company incorporated in Delaware 18 months ago. She photographed the registration documents she found in a subsidiary filing and sent them to Catherine, asking if the legal team's forensic accountant could trace the chain further. On the 7th day, Daniel Voss stopped by her desk. This was not unusual. Daniel stopped by a lot of desks. He was one of those men who managed by presence, who moved through a space and made a point of knowing everyone's name, remembering small personal details, asking the follow-up question that proved he'd been listening last time. It was a skill, and he was good at it, and Evelyn had spent 3 years appreciating it the way she appreciated any competence without particularly personalizing it. He leaned against the edge of her desk, the way he always did. Comfortable. Easy. How's the board summary coming? On schedule, she said. She did not look up from her screen immediately natural, because she was mid-sentence, and when she gave him the expression she'd spent years perfecting, the one that was pleasant and attentive and revealed absolutely nothing. Should be ready by Thursday. Lucian's been particular about this quarter's numbers, Daniel said. He said it lightly, conversationally, but she heard the undertone, that slight lift at the end, the question that wasn't phrased as one. He's always particular, she said. True, he smiled. It was a good smile. Practiced in the same way his interest was practiced, the same way his warmth was practiced, precisely because it looked effortless. Anything unusual turn up in the summary materials. Held his gaze for exactly as long as she would have held it if the question meant nothing. Standard quarterly variation, she said. Nothing that shouldn't be there. Beat. Half a second, she counted it. Great, Daniel said. Smiled again. Straightened up. Let me know if you need anything. Of course, she said. She watched him walk away unhurried, easy, pausing to say something to Petra that made Petra laugh. She watched him cross the office and disappear through the door to the executive corridor. Then she looked back at her screen and made a very small, very controlled decision to breathe. She texted Lucian's private number. He just asked me directly about the summary. Kept it clean. You should know. The reply came back in 4 minutes. Understood. Keep going. She kept going. On the 9th day, the light changed. Catherine's forensic accountant sent back a report that traced the shell company's account 2 additional layers to a final destination account registered in the name of a holding company, whose sole listed director was a man named Andrew Voss, Daniel's younger brother, who lived in Phoenix, whose LinkedIn profile listed him as a freelance consultant with no discernible clients. Evelyn read the report twice. Then she made a copy, sealed it in a plain envelope, and brought it to Lucian's office without calling ahead. He read it standing up. She watched him do it, watched his face do the thing it had done, with the first pages, the stillness, the jaw, the eyes, tracking back over the same line twice. Except this time, there was something else underneath it. Something that looked like it cost him something. Daniel Voss had been with this organization for 8 years. He had been at Lucian's right hand through two restructurings, 3 federal investigations that went nowhere, and a period 18 months ago that Evelyn only knew about in outline but understood had been genuinely dangerous. He had been trusted completely and specifically, and for a very long time. "I need to present this to the full table," Lucian said. "I know. I'm going to ask you to do it." She had expected this, had run the logic herself, and arrived at the same place. Because if you present it, Daniel knows you built the case. "If I present it, it came from the summary materials. Part of your job function. No special access required." He paused. "And because you built it, you should present it." She thought about this, about the 12 men who had filed out of the conference room 11 days ago while she sat at the table with her wrist exposed. About what it would mean to walk back into that room and stand at the head of it. "When?" she said. "Friday." "All right," she said. She was almost to the door when he spoke again. Evelyn stopped, turned. "I know what I'm asking you to do," he said. "I know it's not what you signed up for when you took this job." She considered him for a moment. The man who had sent 12 people out of a room for her, who had kept his word about the distinction between protection and control, who was looking at her right now, not like a problem to be managed, but like a person he was making a choice about. "I signed up to be useful," she said. "This is useful." She went back to her desk. She had 3 days to prepare. She didn't sleep well. She hadn't expected to. She lay in her apartment, the apartment with the new locks and the security system and the parking structure camera that was now cycling properly, and stared at the ceiling and ran through the presentation in her head. The sequence of documents, the order of evidence, the way to build a case so that the conclusion felt inevitable rather than asserted. She was good at this. She had always been good at this, at seeing the structure of a problem and finding the cleanest line through it. It was the skill that had made her exceptional at every job she'd ever held. Before Caleb had started quietly dismantling her professional reputation piece by piece. On Wednesday night, she woke at 2 a.m. with the cold certainty that she'd missed something in the account layering. She got up, opened her laptop, went back through the forensic accountant's report, and spent 40 minutes confirming that she hadn't missed anything. The chain was complete. The evidence was clean. She went back to bed, lay there for a while, thought about Daniel Voss's face when he'd asked her about the summary, thought about the smile, the ease. 8 years of practiced trustworthiness, deployed in the service of a man who had trusted him completely. She thought about Caleb, about how good Caleb had been at the same performance, about how long she'd spent believing in it. She wasn't naive enough to think that made her and Lucian the same. They weren't the same. Their situations were not equivalent, and their histories were not comparable, and she was not going to make the mistake of flattening complex things into simple ones just because there was a surface-level rhyme. But she understood something about what it felt like to look at evidence and have to accept that the person you trusted had been lying to your face for a very long time. She understood the specific weight of that. She fell asleep just before 4. Friday morning, Evelyn arrived at 7:38. She made coffee. She checked the calendar. She confirmed that all 12 people who needed to be in the room at 10 o'clock had confirmed their attendance. She did this calmly and efficiently, and without her hand shaking, which she considered an achievement. At 9:55, she collected her folder-printed documents, organized and tabbed, and walked to the conference room. Daniel was already there. He was in his usual seat, 2 down from the head of the table, talking to a man named Garrison about something that made Garrison laugh. He glanced up when Evelyn came in and gave her a pleasant nod. She nodded back, set her folder at the head of the table. He registered that. She saw his eyes track to the folder at the head of the table and then back to her face. Pleasant look didn't change, but something behind it did, the same way warmth could shift register without disappearing. Lucian came in at 9:59. He took his seat. He looked at Evelyn once, a brief look that said nothing and meant something, and then he looked at the room. "Before we get into the standard agenda," he said, "Evelyn has a report." 12 faces turned toward her. She stood at the head of the table where Lucian Moretti usually stood, and she opened her folder, and she began. She spoke for 22 minutes. She did not apologize for the complexity of the material. She did not soften the conclusions. She walked through every transaction, every layered account, every transfer, every timestamp, and she answered every question that interrupted her with the same level precision she'd brought to building the case in the first place. She did not look at Daniel until she reached the final document, the forensic accountant's report, the listing of the destination account, and its registered director. Then she looked at him. His face had gone entirely still. Not the controlled stillness of a man who is managing his reaction, the different, more complete stillness, a man whose performance has run out of material. The room was very quiet. Lucian spoke first, quietly. Daniel. Daniel looked at him. For a long moment, the two men looked at each other across the length of the table. 8 years of something that had looked like loyalty and had been something else the whole time. "I want my attorney," Daniel said. His voice was flat. The warmth was completely gone. Without it, his face looked different, sharper and smaller at the same time. "That's your right," Lucian said. 2 men Evelyn recognized from security came in through the side door. Daniel stood up slowly. He didn't look at Evelyn again. He walked out between the 2 men with his jacket still on and his hands at his sides, and the door closed behind him, and the room exhaled. Evelyn closed her folder. Across the table, men who had spent 3 years looking through her like she wasn't. They were looking at her now, with an expression she recognized, but had never received from this direction. She had seen that expression on the faces of women who worked in offices, when a man who had underestimated them stopped being able to. It was not quite surprise. It was the specific recalibration that happens when you realize you have been reading something wrong for a very long time. Lucian looked at her from the head of his own table, or rather from the position 2 seats down from where she was standing at the head of his table. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She picked up her folder and walked toward the door. She had the rest of the day's work still waiting. She had a call with Catherine at 2. She had an inbox, and a job that needed her attention, and a job that still needed doing, and a life that was still in the process of being rebuilt from the inside out. But as she crossed through the door into the corridor, she was aware quietly and without ceremony that something had just changed permanently. She had walked into that room as the executive assistant, a woman who organized other people's information and handed it to the people who mattered. She had just stood at the head of that table for 22 minutes and taken the room apart with her own hands. There was no version of the next day where she walked back into that building and was what she had been before. And 3 floors below, in the lobby she'd been crossing for 3 years with her eyes down and her sleeves pulled low, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She stopped. "Read it. You made a mistake getting involved in things that don't concern you. I hope you understand what that costs." No name, no number she recognized. She stood in the corridor outside the conference room, with the noise of the building moving around her, and read the message twice. Then she screenshotted it, forwarded it to Catherine and to Marco, and typed back a single word before blocking the number. Noted. She put her phone in her pocket and went back to work. But her hands, for the first time all morning, were not quite steady. The message sat in her forwarded folder for 6 hours before Marco traced the number. Burner phone, purchased with cash at a convenience store on West Madison 3 days ago. Activated once, used once, and already dark by the time the trace came back. Marco laid the report on her desk without comment, which was its own kind of comment, the specific silence of a man who had seen this pattern before and knew what it meant. Evelyn read the report, set it down, picked up her coffee, found it had gone cold, and drank it anyway. She had expected Caleb to react. She had been expecting it since the moment she'd retained Catherine, since the moment she'd started building the legal record, since the first time she'd refused to minimize what he'd done and instead written it down in clean, precise language on a document that now existed in 3 separate locations and 1 attorney's filing system. She had expected him to escalate. Men like Caleb always escalated when they lost the thing that made them feel safe, and what made Caleb feel safe was her silence. What she had not fully accounted for was the timing. The message had come within 4 hours of Daniel Voss being walked out of the building. She sat with that for a moment, turned it over, looked at the edges of it. 2 things were not necessarily connected. Caleb had been watching her, tracking her movements, waiting for pressure points that was established. Timing could be coincidence. She had been visible in new ways recently, and visibility was its own kind of provocation for a man who had spent years depending on her invisibility. But she pulled up the trace report again. 3 days ago. The burner phone had been purchased 3 days ago, 2 days before Daniel was walked out, which meant Caleb had been planning this message before the board meeting, which meant it wasn't a reaction to the board meeting, which meant something else had told him to move now. She sat very still at her desk and let that thought complete itself. Someone had told Caleb something about the investigation, about the timeline, about the fact that things were moving. Someone who knew enough about what was happening inside this organization to understand that this week was the week to apply pressure. She did not let herself arrive at the conclusion immediately. She was careful about conclusions, careful the way you get when you have made expensive mistakes by trusting the surface of things. She made herself list the alternative explanations. She made herself test each one. She made herself be rigorous about it. But the rigorous version of her thinking arrived at the same place the instinctive version did. She picked up her phone and called Catherine. "Walk me through it again," Catherine said. No preamble. That was what Evelyn valued about her. "Caleb has been watching me for months. Parking structure, the appearances, the apartment. But his movements have been reactive. He shows up where I am. He responds to my actions. He's not proactive, he's adaptive." Agreed. That matches his pattern. The burner was bought 3 days before the board meeting. Before I'd done anything publicly visible, the only thing that changed 3 days before the board meeting was, she paused, that I told Lucian I had something, that I was building a case against Daniel. Beat on the line. Catherine was quiet in the specific way she got quiet when she was processing something she didn't like. "Who knew you were building it?" Catherine said. "Lucian. Marco, tangentially, he knew something was happening, but not specifically what. And you." She paused. "And Daniel. Daniel knew I was looking at the summary materials. He asked me directly. But Daniel didn't know what you found. I told him nothing unusual." She stopped. "But if he suspected I'd found something, if he had any reason to think the case was being built, and if he had a contact outside the organization who had leverage over me, you're saying Daniel fed information to Caleb?" "I'm saying the timing is a question I can't explain any other way." She kept her voice even. "I'm saying someone told Caleb to move this week, specifically, and the people who knew enough to tell him that are a very short list." Catherine was quiet for 4 full seconds. "That's a significant accusation." "I know. Do you have anything beyond the timing?" "Not yet." "Then we hold it. We don't move on speculation." A pause. "But Evelyn, if this is what you think it is, then Caleb knowing about the legal record changes the threat level. He's not just watching anymore. He's coordinating." "I know," she said again. After she hung up, she sat at her desk and breathed carefully through her nose and thought about what it meant. For Caleb Mercer, a man who had spent 3 years dismantling her life through careful, patient, invisible pressure, to suddenly have a friend inside the organization that had been keeping her safe. She told Lucian that evening. Not in the office. He'd asked her to stay after the building cleared, a thing he'd never done before, and she understood that the board meeting had changed the geometry of things, without either of them yet having the language for how. He listened to all of it without interrupting. He had his jacket off, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he was standing by the window again, the Chicago window, the city doing its indifferent thing outside the glass. She sat at the conference table, different positions than 11 days ago, everything slightly rearranged. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Daniel's attorney has already made contact," he said. "He's angling for a deal-reduced personal exposure in exchange for cooperation on related matters." "Related matters," she repeated. "He's claiming the financial arrangement was not his initiative. He said it the way you say something you have already sat with long enough to take the edge off it. He's claiming he was approached, that the scheme was designed by someone else, and he was the inside access." She felt the cold move up her spine. "Who?" Lucian turned from the window. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite grief, and was something that lived uncomfortably between them. "His attorney hasn't given us the name. That's the deal, the name in exchange for reduced exposure." He paused. Daniel said one thing without the attorney present when they were processing him out. He said it to Marco. She waited. He said, "Tell her she should have stayed invisible." The room was quiet enough that she could hear the ventilation system, the distant sound of the city, her own blood moving. He knew, she said. He wasn't just skimming. He was positioned. Someone put him there. That's what it looks like. How long? If the scheme started when the forensic accountant traced it, 18 months. But Daniel has been in this organization for 8 years. He let that sit. The question is whether the last 18 months were the beginning of something or the end of a much longer arrangement. Evelyn thought about Daniel stopping by her desk, the easy smile. Anything unusual turn up in the summary materials? The specific precision of that question, not how's the work going, not what's taking so long, but the exact question that would tell him whether she had found what she had found. She thought about how she'd answered, standard quarterly variation. Nothing that shouldn't be there. She thought about how he'd known enough to ask. Some outside this organization has been running a source inside it, she said, potentially years. And now that source is compromised. She paused. They're going to need a new pressure point. Lucian looked at her steadily. Yes, and the message to me was not a coincidence, he said, and not just Caleb being reactive. He came away from the window and sat down across from her, the same positioning as 11 days ago, except everything was different now. I think you're right that someone told him to move. I think the timing of it the same week Daniel's exposed is not an accident. I think Caleb is connected to whoever was running Daniel. I think it's possible. He held her gaze. I think it's also possible that whoever is on the other end of that arrangement decided that the most effective pressure on me right now is pressure on you. She let herself hear what that meant. Let herself sit inside it for a moment, the full ugly shape of it. That she was not just a target because of Caleb. That she had become a pressure point, specifically because of her position in this building, in this organization, in the proximity to Lucian that the last 2 weeks had made undeniable. I need to know if I've made things worse for you, she said. You exposed a fraud that's been running for 18 months, he said. You made things clearer. That's not the same as worse. It's not the same as better either. No, he agreed. It's not. They sat with that for a moment. The honest version of a complicated situation. What happens to Daniel? She asked. That depends on what he gives us. His voice was flat. Not cruel, just the specific flatness of a man who has made peace with the fact that some questions have answers you don't enjoy, and on how much of what he gives us is true. The article broke on a Thursday morning. Evelyn saw it at 6:42, before she'd finished her first cup of coffee, sitting at her kitchen table in the gray light of a November morning. It was in the Chicago digital edition of a national outlet, bylined by a journalist named Claire Walsh, who covered financial crime and corporate misconduct. The headline was measured deliberately so. She would understand later, but the content was not. Sources question Moretti Group's internal controls following alleged fraud. She read it twice, fast the first time, slow the second. Her stomach dropped on the fast read and settled somewhere cold and specific on the slow one. The article was careful. Walsh was clearly a good journalist. She hadn't printed anything that was technically false. What she had done was arrange true things in a sequence that led inevitably to a conclusion that wasn't supported by the full picture. The fraud allegation was accurate. Daniel Voss was named. The internal investigation was mentioned. But the framing positioned it as a symptom evidence of broader instability, questionable oversight, an organization whose ethical controls were, according to unnamed sources, more performance than substance. And then, in the fourth paragraph, her name. Among those identified in connection with the internal review is Evelyn Hart, executive assistant to Moretti Group, CEO Lucian Moretti, whose sources describe as having taken on an expanded role in sensitive financial matters, despite no formal qualifications in forensic accounting or compliance. She read that paragraph 3 times. It was not an accusation. It was a question mark, placed carefully, designed to look like journalism. But what it actually was, what she understood with absolute clarity after the third read, was Caleb's fingerprints. That specific technique, not a lie, but an arrangement of true things that created a false impression. Evelyn Hart, no formal qualifications, sensitive financial matters, expanded role, each element individually defensible. The combination designed to make her look like either an opportunist or a plant. She called Catherine at 7:03. I've seen it, Catherine said. She was already in her office. Don't respond to anything. Don't post. Don't call anyone from your personal phone. Don't reach out to former colleagues. Give me until noon. Someone fed Walsh the story. Yes, it's Caleb. It reads like Caleb, Catherine said carefully. We need to be Catherine. Her voice came out harder than she intended. I have spent 3 years watching him do exactly this. Arrange true things into false pictures. Give people just enough information to doubt me, without giving them anything they could be held accountable for. She stopped, breathed. I know his work. This is his work. A pause. I believe you, Catherine said, and I'm going to prove it. Give me until noon. At 9:15, Evelyn walked into the Moretti building the same way she always did. She had thought about this in the car, thought about whether to call ahead, whether to come in late, whether to give the building time to absorb the article before she walked through it. She had thought about it and decided against all of those options, because every one of them was some version of making herself smaller. And she had made herself smaller for 3 years, and it had not kept her safe, and it had not made anything better, and she was done with it as a strategy. She walked in at 9:15, took the elevator, sat at her desk, opened her email. The subject lines told her everything about who had read the article. There were 4 emails from people she barely knew who were clearly fishing for information under the cover of concern. There was one from a former colleague, genuine, she thought, but uncertain. There was nothing from anyone inside the building, which meant either they were waiting for guidance or they already knew something she didn't. There was one email from an address she didn't recognize, sent at 7:51 A. Miss Hart, my name is Claire Walsh. I'd like to speak with you before I file my follow-up piece. I want to make sure I have the full picture. Please call me. Phone number, a direct line. Evelyn stared at the email for a long moment. A journalist who was doing a hit piece didn't reach out to the subject, asking for the full picture. A journalist who had been handed a story by a source with an agenda and was now looking at the source agenda and wondering whether she'd been used, that journalist reached out. She forwarded the email to Catherine with a single line. She knows something's wrong with what she was given. At 10:30, Lucian called her into his office. He looked like he hadn't slept. Not wrecked, he was not a man who went wrecked easily, but the particular tightness around the eyes of someone who had been running calculations in the dark for several hours and didn't love where they kept landing. The board wants a statement, he said. The legal team is drafting something. The legal team's statement will be careful and correct and will accomplish nothing, she said. It'll read like management protecting itself, which is what Walsh will report on. He looked at her. What do you want to do? I want to talk to Walsh. That's a significant risk. I know, if she's running a story designed to damage this organization's. She's not, Evelyn said. Or she was, and now she's not sure. She emailed me this morning asking for the full picture. That's not what you do when you have the story you want. That's what you do when you've realized your source has an agenda. He was quiet for a moment. She could still use whatever you give her. Yes, she could. She met his gaze. Or she could use it to write the actual story, which is that a man spent 3 years systematically destroying my professional reputation, stealing from me financially, and using my silence as his primary weapon. That he has now attempted to extend that weapon into this organization by feeding a journalist a carefully arranged half-truth. She paused, and that I'm not silent anymore. Lucian looked at her for a long measuring moment. Then, what do you need? Catherine on the call, and access to the documentation we've built. All of it. He nodded once. You'll have it. Call with Walsh lasted an hour and 40 minutes. Catherine was in the room. Evelyn had the documentation folder open in front of her, the bank records, the withdrawal pattern, the shell company trace, the timeline of professional sabotage that Catherine's team had spent weeks assembling, the records of every contact Caleb had made with former employers, the dates, the language, the specific phrases that recurred across multiple accounts, because a man who deployed the same playbook repeatedly leaves the same fingerprints. Walsh asked hard questions. Evelyn answered them. Not easily. Walsh was thorough and skeptical and not inclined to swap one convenient narrative for another, but completely. She showed Walsh the documents. She named the pattern. She was precise about what she could prove and clear about what she was asserting without proof and careful about the distinction. Halfway through the call, Walsh asked the question Evelyn had been waiting for. The source who gave me the initial story without naming them, can you tell me what their relationship to you is? Evelyn looked at Catherine. Catherine gave a small nod. The person who gave you that story, Evelyn said, has a documented history of providing carefully arranged, partial truths about me to professional contacts in order to damage my credibility. He has done this to at least 2 former employers. I have records of both. The technique is consistent with what appeared in your article, true individual elements assembled to create a false overall impression. She paused. I'm not telling you who he is. I'm telling you that if you look at the sourcing and ask yourself whether the person who gave you this story might have had a personal motivation to damage me specifically, you will find an answer. A long silence on the line. I'd like to see those employer records, Walsh said finally. Catherine will send them this afternoon, Evelyn said. The follow-up article ran 6 days later. Evelyn was not in her apartment when it published. She was at Catherine's office, where she had spent the previous 3 days in a sequence of meetings that had stripped away the last of the comfortable distance between what she'd been enduring and what it looked like written down in full. Walsh had done her job. The article was not a redemption piece. It was not that kind of journalism, and Evelyn hadn't wanted that kind. It was a careful, documented account of a specific pattern. The financial coercion, the professional sabotage, the systematic isolation, and the attempt to extend that pattern into a public smear using a journalist as an unwitting delivery mechanism. Caleb was not named in the article. Walsh's legal team had been cautious about that. Pending the outcome of the civil case Catherine had filed the previous week. But the pattern was named. The technique was named. Former employers, contacted by Walsh independently, confirmed they had received communication that influenced their impressions of Evelyn's professional conduct. 2 of them apologized on the record. One of them had been her supervisor for 4 years. Reading his statement, Evelyn felt something move through her chest that was not quite relief, and not quite grief, the specific emotion that arrives when you discover that something you'd blamed yourself for was never your fault to begin with. And that understanding doesn't undo the years you spent believing otherwise. She was reading the article on her phone in Catherine's conference room when her phone lit up with a number she recognized. Caleb, not a burner, his actual number. The one she'd blocked and unblocked. And blocked again across 3 years, because blocking it felt like a decision she wasn't ready to make permanent, and not blocking it felt like leaving a door open, and neither option felt clean. She stared at his name on the screen for 3 full rings. Then she answered. You made a mistake, he said. No warm-up, no warmth. Whatever performed kindness had once been his opening move was gone. What was underneath it was colder and flatter, and she understood, more honest. You should have stayed quiet. You had a quiet life. You had a Caleb. Her voice was completely level. She was aware of Catherine, across the conference table, going very still. I'm recording this call. My attorney is in the room. Anything you say from this point forward will be included in the civil filing. A beat. You don't have anything, he said. But something had shifted in his voice. A hairline crack in the flatness. Catherine. She didn't look away from the middle distance. The focused, unfocused gaze of someone doing 2 things at once. Can you confirm what we filed this morning? Catherine's voice. Steady and dry. Complaint filed. Cook County Circuit Court. Financial coercion, harassment, professional defamation, and unauthorized access to residential premises. We've requested a temporary restraining order. Hearing is set for Tuesday. She heard him breathe.
You can't.
He stopped, started again. You don't understand what you're doing. I understand exactly what I'm doing, she said. I've been doing it carefully for 4 months, and I have documentation for all of it. She paused. I'm going to hang up now. Don't call this number again. She ended the call. Her hands were shaking. She put the phone face down on the table and pressed her palms flat against the surface and breathed through it, 4 counts in, 4 counts out the way she'd learned to manage the shaking when it came, because it always came eventually, even when everything else stayed controlled. The body keeping its own account. Catherine slid a glass of water across the table without being asked. That's going in the file, Catherine said. I know. She picked up the water, drank half of it. He sounded different. He's scared. He doesn't get scared. Everyone gets scared when the control is gone, Catherine said. Not unkindly, just factually. He's been running this through your silence for 3 years. Your silence is gone. That's new territory for him. Evelyn set the glass down. Her hands had stopped shaking. She noted that. Filed it. Tuesday, she said. Tuesday, Catherine confirmed. Sunday night, Evelyn was in her apartment, the apartment with the new locks. The security system, the parking camera that cycled correctly when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't know. She almost didn't open it. Her thumb was already moving to the block option. Then she saw the first 3 words in the preview. I can help. She opened it. Ms. Hart, this is Claire Walsh. I'm sorry to contact you this way. I have information I think you need to see before Tuesday. Concerns your former fiancé and a third party I've identified in the course of my reporting. I don't think you know about this. I need you to know about it before you walk into that hearing. Please call me tonight if you can. Evelyn read it twice. Then she sat down on the floor of her kitchen, just sat down, her back against the cabinet, her legs folded under her, and tried to think clearly about what a journalist, who had already written one story about her, and was now reaching out at 9 p. on a Sunday with language like, I don't think you know about this, and before you walk into that hearing actually meant. Walsh had been careful. Walsh had been thorough. Walsh had shown, across the course of their conversations, the specific judgment of someone who checked things before she said them. Which meant, if Walsh said there was something Evelyn didn't know about, there probably was. She called Catherine first, woke her up, explained the message. Catherine was quiet for a moment, and then said, call her. I'll stay on the line. Evelyn called Walsh. Walsh answered on the first ring. She sounded like she'd been awake for a while. I found the third party, Walsh said. The person who approached Daniel Voss 18 months ago. The person who designed the financial scheme and needed an inside contact to run it. A pause. And in the pause, Evelyn could hear Walsh deciding how to say the next part. It's not who you think it is. It's not connected to Lucian Moretti as organization, the way I originally assumed. Who is it? Evelyn said. His name is Richard Caleb Mercer Sr., Walsh said. Your former fiancé's father. He's been running a financial extraction operation, targeting mid-sized private organizations for 11 years. Your former fiancé isn't a secondary player in what's happening to you, Ms. Hart. A beat. He's the delivery mechanism, Walsh said. She sat on the kitchen floor for another 40 seconds after Walsh finished talking. Catherine was still on the line. Evelyn could hear her breathing that particular held-breath quality of someone processing information and not yet ready to respond to it. Say it again, Evelyn said. Her voice came out even. She didn't know how, the father. Richard Caleb Mercer Sr., 63 years old, operates through a network of shell companies and intermediary contacts. I've been tracing him for 4 months on a separate investigation, financial predation, targeting private organizations with complex ownership structures. He finds an inside contact, sets up the extraction mechanism, and collects through layers that make it almost impossible to trace back to him. Walsh paused. Your former fiancé has been embedded in your life for 3 years. He had access to your professional contacts, your financial information, your schedule, your employer. He had everything his father needed to identify Moretti Group as a target and establish a pressure dynamic that would keep you from looking too closely. Evelyn's back was against the cabinet. The tile was cold through her clothes. She was aware of these things. With extraordinary precision, the cold, the hardness, the sound of her own blood, moving the way you become hyper-aware of physical reality when the conceptual reality you're processing is too large to hold all at once. Caleb didn't come after me because of the breakup, she said. Not a question. Working it out loud. No, Walsh said carefully. I think the relationship was I think you were a means of access. I think the controlling behavior, the financial abuse, the isolation, I think those were operational. Keeping you dependent, keeping you from building outside relationships that might have compared notes, keep you in a position where you wouldn't look at anything too closely. He was managing me, Evelyn said. The way you manage an asset. The word sat in the kitchen, like something physical. I'm sorry, Walsh said. And she meant it. Evelyn could hear that she meant it. I know that's... She cut it off. Not rudely. Just firmly. She didn't need the sentence finished. How solid is this? I have corporate registration documents for 11 shell companies across a 14-year period. I have a forensic accountant who has traced 4 of them to accounts held by the senior Mercer. I have 2 former associates who are willing to talk on background. And I have a pause. I have a communication between Richard Mercer Sr. and an email address registered to Daniel Voss from 20 months ago that I obtained through a source I cannot name, but whose reliability I would stake my professional reputation on. Have you taken this to anyone? I'm taking it to you first, because you're walking into a civil hearing on Tuesday. Against someone who is, based on everything I've found, a trained operative in a much larger scheme. And you need to know that before Tuesday. Catherine's voice came through. She'd been quiet so long, Evelyn had almost forgotten she was on the line. Ms. Walsh, this is Catherine Reeves. I need to see everything you have. Tonight if possible. A pause. I can have it to you within the hour. Send it, Catherine said. The documents arrived at 11:47 p.m. Evelyn was at Catherine's office by midnight, because Catherine had called her the moment the files came through and said, in the flattest voice Evelyn had ever heard from her, "Get here." She'd taken a car. She hadn't slept and she wasn't going to sleep, and she'd stopped pretending otherwise. Somewhere around the time she'd gotten off the floor of her kitchen. Catherine's office at midnight was a different place than Catherine's office in daylight. The overhead lights were off. The desk lamp threw a hard circle of yellow light across the documents, spread across the table. Catherine had printed everything, all of it. Walsh's sourcing, the corporate registrations, the forensic accountant's trace, the 2 pages that represented the email chain between Richard Mercer Sr. and a registered address belonging to Daniel Voss. Evelyn sat across from Catherine and read all of it. Catherine watched her read and didn't interrupt. It took 40 minutes. When she finished, she stacked the pages carefully and set them down and put her hands flat on the table. "How does this change Tuesday?" she said. "It complicates it." Catherine leaned back. She looked tired, genuinely tired. The kind that came from being good at a thing that required you to stare at ugly realities for a living. If Caleb is knowingly operating as part of his father's scheme, he's not just a domestic abuse perpetrator. He's potentially a co-conspirator in financial fraud. That's federal territory. The civil case doesn't go away, but it stops being the main event. I need to tell Lucian. Yes, tonight. Catherine looked at the clock on her wall. 12:40. I know what time it is. A beat. Yes, Catherine said again. Tonight. Called him from the car on the way back across the city. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either, which told her some about the kind of person he was when things were in motion, the kind who didn't put it down. I need to see you, she said. Tonight. I know what time it is. Pause. 1 beat. Address, he said. She gave him Catherine's office. He was there in 22 minutes. He came in wearing a dark coat over a shirt that was not the one he'd had on earlier, which meant he had gone home at some point and come back out, and his face had the particular quality of controlled alertness that she had come to recognize as his version of running hot. She laid it out for him across Catherine's conference table. The full picture. Richard Mercer Sr., the shell companies, the 11-year operation, Daniel Voss as the inside contact, Caleb as the instrument of access, 3 years of her life, the relationship, the control, the financial abuse, the professional sabotage as operational infrastructure for a financial predation scheme targeting his organization. He listened to all of it without moving. He was very still in the way. He was always still when something was landing hard: the jaw, the eyes, the quality of the air around him. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. You were never the target, he said. His voice was careful, controlled. You were the access point. Yes. Something moved through his face that she couldn't name and didn't try to. And Caleb has been managing me like an operational asset since before we got engaged. She said it cleanly. She had spent the car ride forcing herself to say it in her head enough times that she could say it out loud, without her voice doing anything she didn't want it to do. Cruelty wasn't incidental. It was functional. Keep me isolated. Keep me financially dependent. Keep me from building any external relationships that might have compared notes or looked too closely at what was happening. Lucian looked at her. Evelyn. Don't. She said it quietly. I know what you're going to say. I don't need it right now. I need to figure out what Tuesday looks like, given this information. Closed his mouth, nodded once. That specific, immediate shift from the personal to the operative, she had come to rely on the way he understood. without her having to explain it, that what she needed from him in this moment was not softness. "Does the hearing proceed?" he said to Catherine. "The civil case proceeds," Catherine said, "but we are now in contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office. I've already put in a call. I expect to hear back first thing in the morning. If federal interest intersects with Tuesday's hearing, we may be looking at a coordination situation." What does that mean for her safety? It means that if Richard Mercer Sr. is aware that his operation has been blown, and he may be, if Caleb is communicating with him, then the threat level has changed. Catherine looked at Evelyn. "Been a nuisance up to now. You are now a material witness in a potential federal fraud case." "That's different," Evelyn said. "Yes," Catherine said. "It is. She didn't go home that night." Lucian's building had a floor of secured residential units used for exactly these situations, visiting associates, people whose security situation required a temporary upgrade, circumstances that didn't have a clean category. He offered it without making it into anything it wasn't. She accepted without making it into anything it wasn't. She slept 4 hours in a room that smelled like new paint, and woke up at 5:50 with her heart going, and the specific clarity of someone who had processed something overnight that she hadn't been ready to process when she lay down. Stared at the ceiling. She had believed on some level that Caleb had loved her once. She had told herself that the cruelty had started as something else, as real feeling gone bad, as genuine connection that curdled under pressure. She had told herself that story because it was easier than the alternative, because the alternative was that she had been selected. That someone had looked at her skills, her access, her professional network, her nature, the specific way she was good at being useful and bad at demanding to be seen, and decided she was a useful instrument and pursued her accordingly. 3 years, the dinners, the conversations, the way he'd looked at her sometimes with what she had read as love. She cataloged them now against this new information, and the catalog was brutal. Every act of apparent affection reread as management. Every moment of apparent vulnerability reread as technique. She was not going to cry about it. She had done enough crying about Caleb Mercer in the dark, of enough different nights to have earned the right to process this one with something harder than tears. She got up, showered, put on the clothes she'd had in her bag. She had started keeping a bag with a change of clothes in her office 3 weeks ago, a habit she'd developed without quite naming why. She made coffee in the small kitchen of the residential floor and stood at the window and watched Chicago wake up and thought about Tuesday. Monday moved fast. The U.S. Attorney's Office called Catherine at 8:15. By 10 they were on a call that included Catherine, a federal prosecutor named Diane Okafor, and Evelyn, who sat at the conference table with her second cup of coffee and answered questions with the same precision she'd brought to the board presentation 3 weeks ago. She had documentation. Yes. She could provide Walsh's sourcing through appropriate channels. Yes. She understood the implications for Tuesday's hearing. Okafor was sharp, efficient, and made no promises. "The civil proceeding is your business," she said. "What I'm telling you is that we have independent interest in the Mercer operation. How those two things interact is something we will manage as it develops." "What I need to know," Catherine said, "is whether we have federal protection in place before my client walks into that courthouse tomorrow." Pause. "What kind of presence do you currently have?" "Private security. One of her employer's people. Keep that in place. We'll have eyes on the building." Another pause. "Tell your client to stay visible. People who operate like the senior Mercer don't like witnesses. The more visible she is, the less useful she is as a target." After the call, Evelyn sat very still for a moment. "Stay visible," she said. "Yes," Catherine said. "That's the opposite of everything I've done for 3 years." "I know." Catherine looked at her steadily. "Are you ready for opposite?" She thought about it. Actually thought about it, which was different from answering reflexively. Thought about what it had cost her to be invisible and what it had gotten her, and whether the math had ever worked in her favor. "Yes," she said. Lucian found her at 6 p.m. She was in the conference room, going through the hearing documents. One more time, the full civil filing, the documentation, the evidence Catherine had organized into a sequence that built the case, piece by piece, until the conclusion was impossible to avoid. She heard him come in but didn't look up. He sat down, put a paper cup of coffee on the table next to her. "You don't have to be there tomorrow," he said. "Yes, I do. The attorneys can handle Lucian." She looked up. "I have to be there." He held her gaze for a moment. He wasn't arguing. He'd known, before he said it, that she was going to say what she'd said. She could see that he'd known. He had said it anyway, which meant he'd needed to give her the option. Not because he expected her to take it, but because the offering of it was its own thing. "Okay," he said. "I need you to do something for me. Name it. Don't come." She watched his face. "Don't be in that courtroom." "Not because I don't." She stopped, chose the words carefully. "If you're there, the story becomes about your organization, about Moretti Group and what was stolen from it. That's a real story, and it matters. But it's not the only story. Tomorrow, I need the story to be about me, about what was done to me, about the fact that I built this case and I'm standing in that room on my own authority." She paused. "Does that make sense?" A long moment. "Yes," he said. And she heard in that single syllable that it had cost him something, and she respected him more for not qualifying it. "Thank you," she said. He stood up, looked at her across the table. Documents spread between them, the city going dark outside the window, the weight of everything that had accumulated in the past weeks, sitting in the room like a third presence. "You're going to be fine tomorrow," he said. "I know," she said, and meant it. She was in the courthouse at 8:47 Tuesday morning. Catherine was beside her. Marco was outside, which she'd agreed to and which she understood as the reasonable version of Lucian, keeping his word, not present, but not entirely absent either. The corridor outside the courtroom was beige and fluorescent, and smelled like old coffee and institutional carpet. She had dressed carefully, not to impress, not to appear non-threatening, dressed like herself. Dark blazer, the good boots, her hair down. The version of herself she'd been working back toward for 4 months. She saw Caleb before he saw her. He was at the far end of the corridor with his attorney, a man in a gray suit whose haircut cost more than most people's car payments. Caleb had dressed carefully, too. He always dressed carefully. He looked like exactly what he wanted to look like, a reasonable professional man who had been unfairly entangled in an unfortunate situation. Then he looked up and saw her. She watched his face in the moment before he could arrange it. That half second where his expression moved through something raw and unmanaged, not quite anger, not quite fear, something she'd seen before in quieter moments of their relationship and had misread as passion, which she understood now had been neither anger nor passion, but calculation. He arranged his face. She did not arrange hers. She looked at him with her face as it was clear, direct, without apology, and she did not look away. His attorney said something to him. He turned. When he looked back, she was already following Catherine through the courtroom door. The hearing lasted 3 hours and 14 minutes. In the first 40 minutes, Caleb's attorney moved to dismiss on procedural grounds. Catherine had anticipated every one of the procedural grounds and disposed of them with the specific efficiency of someone who has done this exact work for 20 years and is no longer interested in theater. In the second hour, the financial documentation went into the record. Every withdrawal, every transfer, the shell company trace, the employer contacts, the dates, the amounts, the pattern. Catherine walked through it without drama, the same way you lay stones for a path, each one placed precisely where it needed to go, so that walking from one end to the other felt inevitable. Caleb's attorney objected 4 times. The judge sustained 1 objection and overruled 3. In the third hour, it was Caleb's turn. She watched him testify from her seat at the plaintiff's table. She had expected him to perform the reasonable man. Well, he was excellent at performance, but something had shifted from the corridor to the witness chair. He was careful, too careful. The pauses before his answers were a half-beat too long. The precision of his language too managed. The whole presentation adding up to a man who was extremely aware of what was being recorded. His attorney asked him about the financial transactions. He had explanations. He always had explanations. The explanations were detailed and specific and internally consistent, and they did not match the documentary evidence. Catherine cross-examined for 22 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not editorialize. She asked questions in a sequence that moved from specific document to specific transaction to specific discrepancy, and each question required Caleb to either confirm the document or deny it. And each confirmation built the next question, and by the end of it, the explanations had become a structure that couldn't hold its own weight. "Mr. Mercer," Catherine said near the end, "the withdrawal of $4,300 from the joint account on March 17th, you testified this was for shared household expenses." "That's correct." "Can you identify the household expense?" Pause. "It was various things, groceries, utilities. The account Miss Hart has identified as the destination account for this transfer was opened 11 days earlier. Is that the account where you deposited grocery and utility payments?" His attorney started to object. The judge looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Catherine. For just a moment, just a flicker, the performance ran out. "I need to review my records," he said. "Your records," Catherine said, "have been subpoenaed. They're in front of the court." She set a document on the exhibit table. "This is the record of the destination account. There are no grocery or utility transactions. There are, however, 3 subsequent transfers to an account held by a corporation registered in Delaware. Do you recognize that corporation?" The silence lasted long enough that the courtroom clock became audible. "I'd like to speak with my attorney," Caleb said. The judge called a 15-minute recess. They reconvened. Caleb's attorney requested a sidebar that lasted 11 minutes. When they came back, the attorney indicated that his client was prepared to discuss settlement parameters. Catherine looked at Evelyn. A single look, clean and brief. Evelyn gave the smallest nod. She had known this moment would come. She had imagined it many times across 4 months, what it would feel like to be sitting in this room at this table, with Caleb's strategy collapsed around him and his attorney pivoting toward the exit. She had imagined feeling something large and consuming. Vindication, triumph, the cinematic release of 3 years of accumulated weight. What she actually felt was smaller and more real than any of that. It was the specific feeling of a locked door, opening, not dramatic. Just the click of a mechanism releasing after a long time under pressure. Like a breath you'd been half holding that you could finally stop. Turned her attention back to the front of the room and listened to what came next. But as she turned, her phone buzzed once on the table beside her. She looked at the screen under the table. A text from a number she didn't recognize. It's different from the burner. Different from anything she'd seen before. "This changes nothing. You don't understand what you've walked into. Tell Moretti that Richard says hello." Her hand went very still on the phone. Catherine was watching the attorneys confer. The judge was reviewing a document. The room was in the particular suspended animation of a proceeding that had shifted trajectory and hadn't yet landed in its new direction. Evelyn looked at the message. Read it twice. The syntax of it: tell Moretti that Richard says hello, not threatening, in the way Caleb's messages had been threatening. Operational. The language of a man who was already moving his pses to the next position. Richard Mercer Sr., not watching from a distance anymore. She screenshot the message and forwarded it to Catherine with a single word: Now. Catherine's phone vibrated against the table. She looked down. Read. Her expression didn't change, but she reached under the table and typed something and sent it. 3 minutes later, Evelyn's phone buzzed again. Marco. Received. We're moving. The judge looked up from the document. Shall we proceed? Caleb's attorney said, Your Honor, my client would like to. Courtroom doors opened, not dramatically. They open the way. Doors open in federal buildings, controlled, deliberate, by people who moved like they had the authority to move that way. 2 people in suits who were not courthouse staff and were not press, and whose bearing communicated something specific to everyone in the room who had ever been in the proximity of federal law enforcement. They handed something to the court clerk. The judge read it. His expression did not change, but he set it down with a particular care. Mr. Mercer, the judge said, it appears we have a development. At the plaintiff's table, Evelyn Hart sat straight in her chair, with her hands flat on the documents in front of her, and felt the room reorganize itself around a new center of gravity. She had walked into this courthouse this morning as the subject of a civil proceeding. She was sitting in this chair right now, as something else as the woman who had pulled the thread, as the witness whose testimony and documentation had given federal investigators the piece they needed to move, as the person who was no longer the smallest thing in the room, but was instead somehow exactly at the center of everything that was about to break open. Caleb turned in his chair and looked at her. She looked back. She did not look away first. The 2 people in suits were names Diane Okafor and Special Agent Thomas Reel, and the document they had handed to the court clerk was a federal notice of interest in the proceedings, which was the polished legal language for the less polished reality that the U.S. Attorney's Office had been building a case that intersected materially with what was happening in this room and needed the civil proceeding to pause while the larger architecture became visible. The judge read the notice a second time, set it down, looked at the room over the top of his glasses with the expression of a man who has presided over enough proceedings to recognize when something has just changed categories. We'll recess until 2 p.m., he said. Caleb's attorney was already leaning toward his client, his voice low and urgent. Caleb was not looking at his attorney. He was looking at the 2 federal agents who had stationed themselves with careful casualness near the door, and his face had gone the specific gray of a man whose calculations have just failed him in every direction simultaneously. Evelyn watched him for a moment. 3 years of her life sat between them like wreckage from a structure that had finally come down. She waited to feel something dramatic about his face. In this moment, some rush of satisfaction, some answering collapse in herself. She felt instead the same small click she'd felt earlier, the mechanism releasing. Steady, quiet, not nothing, but not what the movies would have made of it. She gathered her documents, stood up, followed Catherine out. In the corridor, Okafor found them within 4 minutes. She was a compact woman in her 40s who moved like she had already mapped every exit in the building, which she probably had. She shook Catherine's hand, then Evelyn's, and said, "We need somewhere private," which meant a small conference room, 2 floors up, that smelled like bad coffee, and had a window that looked into a concrete air shaft. "The text you received this morning," Okafor said. She didn't sit down. She stood at the head of the table with her hands in her jacket pockets, and she looked at Evelyn directly. "Richard Mercer, Sr. We've been building toward him for 14 months. We had the structure, the shell companies, the extraction mechanism, the pattern, across multiple targets. What we didn't have was a current active operation that could document in real time." She paused. "Case gave us that. Daniel Voss," Catherine said. "Voss is cooperating. He gave us communication records going back 22 months. Okafor looked at Evelyn. What you found in those quarterly reports the pattern, the threshold calibration that was Mercer Sr.'s design. He writes the playbook, and his inside contacts execute it. Voss was not the first. He will not be the last if we don't close the architecture. What do you need from me? Evelyn said. Your complete documentation. Everything you built, everything Walsh shared with you, everything Catherine's forensic accountant produced. Okafor paused. And your testimony, when we get there. You built the evidentiary chain that connected this operation to Moretti Group. You're going to need to explain how you found it and what it means. I can do that. It won't be comfortable. Mercer Sr.'s attorneys will challenge your methodology, your access, your qualifications, your motivations. They'll try to make you into a character rather than a witness. People have been trying to make me into a character for 3 years, Evelyn said. Practice. Okafor looked at her for a moment. Something moved through her expression, not quite a smile, but the shadow of professional appreciation. Good, she said. We'll be in touch. The afternoon session reconvened at 2:15. Caleb's attorney had spent the recess talking to someone on the phone in the parking structure. Evelyn knew this because Marco had been watching the building and sent her a text at 1:47 that said simply he's been on the phone for 40 min. She had read the text and put her phone away and eaten half a sandwich Catherine had produced from somewhere without being asked. When they came back in, Caleb's attorney indicated to the judge that his client was prepared to discuss a comprehensive settlement. The language was careful and specific and cost Caleb's attorney something visible to say it. You could see it in the set of his mouth, the particular way he held his jacket closed with one hand. Catherine looked at the judge. The plaintiff is prepared to hear the parameters. Took 2 hours. Evelyn sat at the plaintiff's table and listened to her attorney and Caleb's attorney negotiate the terms of Caleb's complete surrender in the language of civil law, which was cleaner and less satisfying than the word surrender implied. And also, she was discovering exactly the right instrument for the job. Not a confession, not an apology, a binding legal agreement with teeth, full financial restitution, every dollar traced and documented, plus interest. Formal written retractions to both former employers Caleb had contacted. A binding no-contact order, permanent with enforcement provisions that had consequences attached to them. His attorney had tried for a sunset clause on the no-contact order, and Catherine had declined with a single word. At 4:41, the settlement was signed. Evelyn signed her name in the quiet room with the fluorescent lights and the old coffee smell, and she was aware that her hand was steady, and that Caleb, 3 feet away at the same table, did not look at her while she signed, and that his inability to look at her now, this man who had stood in her kitchen and held her arm and explained things to her until she stood still, was its own small, complete resolution. Capped her pen, slid the document back to Catherine. Stood up. Caleb stood up too. For a moment they were both upright in the same room, and she thought he might say something. She could see him calculating whether to, and then he didn't. And his attorney touched his elbow, and they turned toward the door. She watched him go, his back, the good jacket, the careful way he moved. She waited until the door had closed behind him. Then she exhaled, slowly, all the way to the bottom of her lungs, and stood in the quiet of the room and let the 3 years of it settle into the past tense where they belonged. Catherine drove her back to the Moretti building. They didn't talk much in the car. There wasn't much that needed saying. They had spent months saying the things that needed saying, and what remained now was quieter. and more personal than anything legal language could reach. Curb, Evelyn got out and turned back. Catherine. Her attorney looked at her from the driver's side window. She had mascara that had migrated slightly in the long afternoon heat of the courtroom, and her jacket was creased, and she looked like a woman who had fought hard for several months and won, and was not yet finished, because there was still the federal case to build, still Okafor's requests to fulfill, still work ahead. She looked, in other words, like herself. "Thank you," Evelyn said. Catherine held her gaze for a moment. "Don't thank me," she said. "You built the case. I just filed it. You know that's not entirely accurate. Most things aren't." She put the car in drive. "I'll call you tomorrow. Get some sleep." Evelyn watched her pull away. Then she turned and walked into the building. Lucian was in his office. She had known he would be. She had known. The same way she'd come to know the reliable patterns of this building and the people in it that he would not have left. He was at his desk when she knocked and pushed the door open, and he looked up the same love quality of attention he'd been giving her since the afternoon. She'd pushed up her sleeve in the conference room, and everything had started. Came in, sat down. For a moment she just sat there, and he let her, which was the thing she needed. "It's done," she said. "I know," Marco called. She nodded. "Federal peace is still moving. Okafor called me too." He paused. "I'm going to be in that process as well. Daniel's testimony implicates the organization as a target. I have documentation requests." He said it evenly, not without weight, but without drama. The weight was real. The drama wasn't useful. "We'll handle it." "I know you will." A quiet moment. Outside the windows, the city had turned toward evening. The specific Chicago autumn light, low and gold, and slightly tired, came through the glass and fell across his desk and the documents on it and the cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Not "how are you" that was a social question, a filler. "Are you all right" was a real one. She thought about it. The honest version. "I will be," she said. "I'm not yet, but I can see it from here." He nodded. "That's enough." "Is it?" "It's more than most people manage," he said. She went home that night to the apartment, with the new locks and the security system and the parking structure camera that cycled correctly. She made dinner pasta. Simple, kind of things she made when her brain was done, and ate it at the kitchen table with the overhead light on, and the city sounds coming through the window she'd left open 2 inches because the evening had gone cool and clean. She thought about Richard Mercer Sr., who was somewhere in this city, or not in this city, who had received the message that his operation was compromised and whose next move she couldn't fully predict. She thought about the federal timeline. Okafor had been carefully non-committal about how long the larger case would take to build. Months, possibly longer, during which time she would be a named witness in an active investigation which had its own implications, its own requirements, its own particular quality of unfinished. She thought about Caleb. She thought about who he was without the performed warmth, without the management, without the operational role his father had built for him. She wasn't sure there was much. She wasn't sure it mattered. Question of who Caleb actually was underneath everything he performed had been a question she'd spent 3 years trying to answer. And the answer, when it finally arrived, was that the performance was the point. There was no authentic Caleb being suppressed by the operational one. He had become what he was used for so completely that the distinction between the person and the instrument had long since dissolved. She understood that this was its own kind of loss. Not for her, she had run out of grief for him, somewhere in the courthouse corridor, when she'd watched his face reorganize itself after seeing hers. but the loss of the idea that someone had once looked at her and felt something real. That had been a story she'd kept telling herself even after everything else fell away. And now even that was gone. And what was left in its place was something cleaner and harder, and, she was discovering, more bearable than she'd expected. She washed her dishes, dried them, put them away. She went to bed and slept 7 hours without interruption, which was 3 more than she'd managed on any night in the past 2 weeks. And when she woke at 6:14, she lay in the morning light for a moment and took stock of herself the way you take stock after a long illness, checking what had come back, what was still missing, what had changed permanently. She got up, made coffee, went to work. 6 weeks later, Daniel Voss's cooperation agreement was finalized, and his testimony went into the federal record. Picture it completed was more extensive than even Walsh's reporting had outlined. Richard Mercer Sr. had been running financial extraction operations, targeting lying private organizations for 14 years. Not 11, across 7 states, with a network of inside contact that the federal investigation was still mapping. Daniel was one node in a much larger structure. Caleb had been, as Walsh had written, the delivery mechanism a man raised inside his father's operation and deployed repeatedly against targets with access, skill, and the specific vulnerability of people who were very good at their work and very bad at believing they deserved protection. Evelyn gave her deposition to Okafor's team on a Wednesday in November. She was in the federal building for 6 hours. She drank bad coffee and answered questions in the clean, precise language she had always used when accuracy mattered, and she did not soften anything. And she did not apologize for any of it. When it was done, she sat in the corridor outside the deposition room for a few minutes, not because she needed to cry, not because she was shaking, just because 6 hours of testimony was a long time to maintain the specific quality of attention that testimony required. And she wanted to let her brain do something quieter for a moment before she went back out into the world. A young paralegal she didn't know brought her a cup of water. She thanked him, drank it, stood up, put on her coat, walked out. 2 of Mercer Sr.'s shell companies were frozen by federal order in December. His attorneys filed motions in 3 jurisdictions. The investigation, with the specific slowness of federal machinery, not stalled, just thorough, the kind of thorough that doesn't announce itself and doesn't apologize for its timeline. Evelyn filed her amended professional record with 3 industry organizations in late November, attaching the formal retractions from both former employers. One of them, her supervisor of 4 years, the one whose apology had undone something in her chest, called her personally. She had not expected the call. She had picked up because it was his direct line, and she hadn't had time to decide whether to. "Evelyn," he said. His voice sounded older than she remembered. She stood of Assmore office. Her new office, the one with the city view, and looked at the December light on the buildings across the street. "You were given information by someone I trusted," she said. "You made a reasonable assessment. It wasn't reasonable. I knew your work. I should have trusted your work." She was quiet for a moment. "You're telling me that now," she said. "That matters. Does it fix anything?" "It fixes the specific part of it that you're responsible for," she said. "The rest of it isn't yours to fix." He was quiet. She could hear him sitting with that, the way you sit with something that is both better and worse than you expected. "I'd like to be a reference," he said, "if you ever need one. Going forward, a real one. I might take you up on that," she said. She meant it. She filed it away, not to deploy immediately, not out of urgency, but because the list of people she could call when she needed something was longer than it had been a year ago. and that was its own kind of reconstruction. In January, Lucian offered her the chief of operations position. He did it in her office, not in the conference room, not across the large desk that communicated the hierarchy of things. He came to where she was, which she noticed, and he sat in the chair across from her desk, the visitor's chair, the one she'd been on the other side of for 3 years, and said, "I want to talk to you about something." "I know what you're going to say," she said. "I know you do." He didn't look particularly thrown by this. "Say it anyway. You're going to offer me the chief of operations position." "Yes. And I want to be clear that I'm not interested in it as a reward," she said. Or as she stopped, chose the words, as a way of acknowledging what happened. "What I went through. I don't want to be promoted for surviving something. I'm not offering it for that reason. Tell me the reason." He looked at her steadily. "You spent 3 years in this building, seeing problems before anyone else did, and not saying anything because you'd learned that being visible was dangerous. In the last 4 months, you've been visible, and you've been right, and the organization is better for it." He paused. "I need someone in that role who sees the whole board. You see the whole board. That's the reason." She held his gaze. Testing it. She was good at testing things now, at holding the surface of something up to the light and looking for the shape underneath. What she found underneath was what he'd said. Just what he'd said. "I have conditions," she said. "I assumed you would. I set my own hours during the federal case. The testimony schedule isn't predictable, and I'm not going to shortchange either obligation." "Agreed. I report to you directly, but my decisions in the operational domain are mine. I'll consult, I'll communicate, but I won't need approval for every move. And I want Walsh to have exclusive access when the federal case concludes. The story of what happened in this organization, Daniel, the fraud, the Mercer operation, that story gets told by the journalist who helped break it." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not a condition about the job." "No," she agreed. "It's a condition about the person doing it." A moment. Something moved across his face, that shadow she'd seen before, the one that might have been a smile if his face had been in the habit of making them. "Agreed," he said. She looked at him for another moment. 3 years ago, she had sat across from him in a conference room, and pushed up conference room, and told the trooper sleeve and the truth to a man who hadn't asked her to make it smaller. It was the first in a long chain of decisions that had brought her to this room, this chair, this conversation. "Yes," she said, "I'll take the position." He nodded. He didn't make anything of it, no visible relief, no performance of satisfaction. Just the small settling of something that had been determined before either of them said the word. He stood to go. At the door he paused. "One more thing," he said. She waited. "My mother wants to have dinner," he said. "Sunday evening, nothing formal." He said it. The way you say something, when the simplicity of it is the whole point, and everything that matters is underneath the simplicity. She looked at him. At the door frame he was standing in, the city behind him through the windows, the whole particular weight of what had been built between them across 4 months of crises and documentation and middle-of-the-night calls, and the specific intimacy that develops between people who have seen each other at their most precise and most vulnerable. She thought about Sunday, about what it meant and what it didn't mean, and what it might become. "I'm free Sunday," she said. He nodded once. Left. She turned back to her desk. She had work to do. She had always had work to do, and now she had a new category of it, a new scope, a new set of problems to anticipate and address. She picked up her pen and opened the notebook where she kept her running list of things that needed attention, and she started at the top of the list and worked down. The Walsh article ran in February. It was long, 11,000 words, the kind of piece that didn't get written in daily journalism anymore. The kind that required an editor willing to hold space for a story that was complicated enough to resist a simple headline. The headline, when it came, was measured, the architecture of silence. How a 14-year financial predation network used personal relationships as operational infrastructure. Evelyn's name appeared 17 times, not as a victim, as the person who found the thread. She read it on a Sunday morning at her kitchen table, with her coffee going cold beside her, and when she finished, she sat for a while and let the experience of seeing her own story written down in accurate language settle into her. She had been afraid before it ran that reading it would undo something, that seeing it laid out so completely would reopen things she had managed to close. Instead, it felt like the final piece of documentation, the external record, that matched the internal one. The outside world catching up to what she had known about herself all along. Richard Mercer Sr. was arrested in March, in Phoenix, at the airport. His attorneys immediately began constructing the defense that would take 2 years to fully fail, because federal cases took the time they took and did not apologize for it. Caleb's name appeared in the federal filing as a cooperating witness, which Catherine had predicted, and which meant the full cost of his choices was now distributed differently than any of them had fully anticipated. Not absolved, not clean, complicated in ways that were out of Evelyn's hands, and she was learning, were allowed to stay there. She was not required to be the one who decided what happened to him. She had built the record. She had told the truth. What the truth did next was the work of institutions she had given the evidence to, and letting it be that was its own kind of discipline. She was getting better at it. On a morning in late March, Evelyn walked into the Moretti building at 7:51. She had been coming in later than she used to, not because her commitment had changed, but because she had stopped arriving early as a way of making herself useful before anyone else could question her presence. She arrived when she needed to arrive, which was still earlier than most people, and which she chose because she liked the morning quality of the building, not because she was afraid of what would happen if she didn't. Across the lobby, the security team knew her by name now, which they always had, but the specific quality of how they acknowledged her had shifted in a way she couldn't fully articulate and didn't need to. She took the elevator. She had a meeting at 9 about the restructured operational protocols that her team had spent 3 weeks designing, and before that she had 40 minutes. She had been protecting for a problem in the Eastern distribution contract that had been snagging for 2 weeks and that she had an idea about. She sat down at her desk, her new desk, in her new office with the city view, and opened her laptop and started. At 8:15, her phone lit up with a text from Lucian. Board confirmed the protocol revisions. No objections. And then, after a brief pause, a second message. Good work. She read it twice, not because she needed to read it twice to understand it, because it was the specific combination of professional and simple, and without performance that she'd come to recognize as his version of saying something that mattered to him. She typed back, "Thank you." And then, after her own brief pause, "The distribution contract problem, I think I have it. Talk after the 9 o'clock. He sent back a single word, "Good." Put her phone face down on her desk and looked out at the March morning, the city bright and cold through the glass. The light doing what Chicago light did in early spring, that particular quality of arriving before anyone was ready for it. She thought about the woman who had walked into this building 3 years ago, with her eyes down and her sleeves pulled low and her whole existence calibrated around the project of not being seen. She could remember that woman clearly, could feel the specific weight of how she'd moved through rooms, the constant vigilance of it, the exhaustion of maintaining invisibility as a survival strategy. She didn't feel sorry for that woman exactly. She understood that woman. The choices she'd made had made sense inside the information she'd had and the fear she'd been carrying, and judging her for them would be the same category of mistake as blaming someone for how they breathe when they're drowning, like the score. But she was not that woman anymore. The change had not been dramatic. It hadn't arrived in a single moment of transformation, the way stories sometimes implied. It had been incremental. In the same way, the damage had been incremental. Decision by decision, document by document. The slow accumulation was made in the direction of her own reality, rather than away from it. She had chosen to answer Lucian's question in the conference room. She had chosen to call Catherine. She had chosen to keep building the case when Daniel Voss looked at her across the office and asked what she'd found. She had chosen to stand at the head of the table. She had chosen to talk to Walsh. She had chosen to go on record. She had chosen to sit in that courtroom and not look away. Each choice had led to the next and the next and the next, and the accumulation of them was the person she was sitting in this chair, being right now. A woman with a city view, and a team, and a seat at the table that no one had loaned her, and no one could take back. She looked at her screen. The distribution contract problem was waiting. She had 40 minutes and an idea and work to do. She started. Outside the windows, Chicago moved through its morning, with its characteristic indifference, the traffic, the people, the lake somewhere beyond the buildings, doing whatever the lake did in March. The ordinary world continuing, and inside it, at her desk, in her office, with her name on the door and her coffee at her elbow, and her whole particular intelligence turned toward the problem in front of her, Evelyn Hart worked, not quietly, not invisibly, not in the service of anyone else's comfort or anyone else's perception of what she was or wasn't. She worked because it was what she was good at, because it was what she chose, because the work was hers, and the choices were hers, and the life she was living inside them was entirely, finally, completely her own. She had never been invisible. She had simply spent years surviving by pretending she was. She wasn't pretending anymore.